Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we embark on the next segment of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Join us as we delve into these profound teachings. Carefully compiled by our team, this audiobook serves as a conduit for Buddha's wisdom. Your support in sharing these teachings is invaluable. Subscribe, like, and share to extend their impact. Together, let's enrich the world with Buddha's timeless guidance. Relax and absorb the essence of these teachings as we begin our exploration today. In Charge of Your World. October 19, 2008. There's a story in the canon where King Pasenadi comes to see the Buddha in the middle of the day. And the Buddha asks him, "Where are you coming from in the middle of the day?" The king says, "Oh, I've been meeting with my ministers and talking about the sorts of things that people obsessed with their power talk about." Which is a remarkably frank statement. You can imagine a press conference where a president is asked, "What have you been doing today?" And he says, "Talking about the things that people obsessed with power talk about." The Buddha asks the king, "Suppose someone were to come from the east saying, 'This enormous mountain is moving in from the east, crushing all living beings in its path.' Another person comes from the south saying, 'There's another mountain coming from the south, crushing all living beings in its path.' Another person comes from the west, a person comes from the north. There is a mountain moving in from the west and another mountain moving down from the north, all four mountains, crushing all living beings in their path." The Buddha then asks him, "Given this great destruction of human life, and remembering about how rare it is to gain a human birth, what would you do?" And the king says, "Well, what else could I do but practice the Dharma, train the mind, and do good?" And the Buddha says, "I announce to you, great king, death is moving in, crushing all living beings in its path. So what are you going to do?" And the king says, "Well, what else can you do but practice the Dharma?" We look at the situation in the world right now and there's a lot to be worried about. But we can be confident about one thing, that the best way to respond to whatever the situation is in the world is to practice the Dharma, to be generous, to be virtuous, and to meditate to train the mind. Because whether the situation in the world is good or bad, there is always aging, illness and death. There is no point where the world is so totally free of insecurity that you can really trust that the situation is going to be good. Even if the economy is great and everybody agrees to lay down their arms, people are still going to get sick, still going to get old, and still going to die. But the empowering thing in all this is that your actions do shape the world you experience. The world you've experienced, the world that you're experiencing now, and on into the future. So no matter what anybody else does, you always want to practice the Dharma, to hold by your ideals, to hold by your principles. Because you create your world through your actions, and you want that world to be a principled one. One of the misunderstandings we pick up from the media is that the important decisions in our world are made by other people over whom we have no control. But it's a fact that even though we're sitting here in the same room, each of us lives in a different world. And the world of our experience is created by our own actions. We're the ones who are creating it, and we continue to create it with our actions each moment. So basically you're in charge of your world. You're not a monad totally independent from influences from outside, but the choices you make are the ones that shape your life. If you make wise choices, generous choices, you protect yourself and you protect other people. On the surface it may sound selfish. Here you are trying to make sure your little world is okay, but the only way you can make sure your little world is okay is to act in a way that you're not harming anybody else. And influences spread around. If you act in a noble way even in the midst of danger and destruction, that's a good example to other people. Other people want to join in. Being a human being is not really worth much if it's all just scrambling after wealth, scrambling after things that other people have to be deprived of. The Buddha saw this prior to going out practicing. He said the world was like a puddle that was drying up, and there are all these fish in the puddle fighting for that little last bit of water. He found it really dismaying. That kind of life is not a human life, it's an animal life. Human life is one in which, regardless of what the situation is outside, You know you shape your world through your actions, and that the actions shaping a good world are ones that are honorable, compassionate, wise. And you can hold to that principle. Some people were commenting this evening that the crowd here today was one of the gentlest crowds they had ever seen. That's because we came together to do good, to be generous, and to rejoice in one another's generosity. This is something that's been typical of the Buddhist tradition ever since the very beginning. Back in the 19th century, when Westerners were beginning to read some of the Buddhist texts, and all saw was suffering, death, aging, illness, as a result, they wrote Buddhism off as a very pessimistic religion. But when they went to Asia, they saw that Buddhists in general were very happy people. The temple fairs, the various observances in the course of the year, were always very happy gatherings. And the Westerners came to the conclusion that Buddhists didn't understand their own religion. If they really understood what the Buddha taught, they would be morose and horribly depressed. But instead they were happy. So Westerners came up with a theory of what they called the great tradition versus the little tradition, i.e. the great tradition being what was in the texts and the little tradition being Buddhism on the ground. But what they really missed was the central message in the texts, which is that your happiness is in your hands. And that true happiness comes from behaving in a way that's totally harmless. And not just harmless in the sense that you're not going to hurt other people, but also that you're going to positively do good by practicing generosity as an important part of the path. This is how the Buddha's message is empowering. You can create a happy life by acting in ways that are noble and good. You see this in the Buddhist tradition all the way from the time of the Buddha's funeral. Even though the Buddha had just passed away, there was singing and dancing at his funeral in honor of him. On the one hand, people were sad that he had gone, but on the other, they were honoring the fact that they had been alive when there had been such a wonderful human being in the world. The same with the temple fairs in the very early centuries. They were very happy occasions because everyone got together to do good. Social caste didn't mean anything. Everybody was working together, helping in line with their talents and abilities. So it is possible to create a good society whenever one gathers around the principle that true happiness comes from being harmless, being helpful, training the mind that's empowering. And you don't need to have political power in the world outside. You have the power to create your own world right here, right now through your actions. One thing that would frequently strike me when I was in Thailand was that I'd be on my alms round, walking past a little tiny grass shack, just big enough for 2 people to sleep in. And sure enough, there were 2 people in the grass shack, a newlywed couple, still very poor. One of them would run out of the house and want to put something in my bowl. When you're the beneficiary of the generosity of poor people, it really goes to the heart. I'd come back from my alms round and tell myself, you can't be lazy today. A poor person has been generous with you. The Buddha's teaching gives that opportunity to be generous, to be virtuous, to everybody, regardless of their position on the world. Regardless of how rich or poor you may be, no matter what society may think of you, you have the ability to train your mind. And you can shape your world through that power. The teachings talk about becoming. It's basically your sense of the world in which you live, and your identity within that world. That becoming is based on your actions. Your actions are the field in which a particular sense of the world can grow. You keep on doing things that you know are good, and that creates a good field. The possibilities in that field are always replenished. That's something totally within your power. The world at large may have political strife, economic collapse, all kinds of negative things may be happening, but in your world, you're creating a good world. And you're not the only one benefiting from that. So this is why we train the mind. Regardless of the situation outside, it's through training the mind that we're shaping the world in which we live and the world in which the people around us live as well. So even though the mountains of aging, illness, and death may be moving in, we can still train the mind. Because as the Buddha pointed out, death is not the end. It's one incident in a very long story. Poverty is not the end. Famine, the 4 horsemen, are not really the end. The 4 horsemen have been stampeding all over the world for who knows how long. But we can still do good. And in doing good, we protect ourselves. As the Mangala Sutta points out, your protection lies in the good you do. There was another time when King Pasenadi went to see the Buddha. He had commented that the more he thought about it, the more he realized that people who act in harmful ways in what they do, in what they say, in what they think don't really protect themselves. They don't really love themselves. They leave themselves open to attack from all sides. The people who are well protected are the ones who behave well in thought and word and deed. With that kind of protection, you don't need an army. Or as the Buddha said in the Dhammapada, if your hand doesn't have a wound, then you can pick up poison and not get harmed by it, because you haven't done the sort of thing that would leave an opening for the poison to seep into. In the same way, when you train your mind, you're giving protection to others and to yourself as well. This is how we can live together in peace and harmony. So on a day like this, when people have come together to do good, it's something we should rejoice in. Because that rejoicing helps to remind us where true happiness lies. Giving meaning to life. November 7, 2008. There are passages in the texts where the Buddha gives a pretty bleak picture of life and the world at large. Like that chant just now. The world just passes away. There is no one in charge. It's a slave to craving. In other words, there is no grand design to give meaning to life or the world. Things are simply driven by blind craving. There is another passage where the Buddha talks about the way beings wander on in this world. It's like throwing a stick up into the air. Sometimes it lands on this end, sometimes it lands on that end, sometimes it lands flat in the middle. No real pattern. No real direction. This doesn't mean that life is hopeless. But it means simply that life doesn't have a meaning unless you give it a meaning. So that's the real question. It's not what is the meaning of life, the question is, what kind of meaning do you want to give to it? This is where the practice comes in, because the practice gives direction. You want to understand the mind so you can understand why it is that even though everything we do is aimed at producing happiness, we often end up causing suffering, pain, and disappointment instead. Why is that? And as the Buddha pointed out, it's within our power to learn, to understand why. That quest to learn and to understand is what gives meaning to life, gives direction to life in a way that nothing else can. You look at the things that people try to accomplish in life, in the world outside. The world seems designed to just grind everything down. You want this kind of relationship, but the relationship just falls apart. You want to develop a nice strong body, well, it gets strong for a while, then it starts getting sick, then it gets old, and you're left with nothing. You want to accomplish something large in the world, but then the economy collapses. War comes. Famine comes. All kinds of things can happen. So looking to the world for meaning is a frustrating, very frustrating experience. But when you look inside for meaning, you find that there is a lot to learn, there is a lot to understand. Things do get accomplished. As you work on the path, you begin to see how the mind creates a thought world, and you realize that you have the choice to go into that thought world or not. As you develop more and more mindfulness, more and more alertness, you understand these processes of the mind. Through understanding them, you can free yourself from them. You don't have to be their slave. The world that's a slave to craving. You don't have to get into that world. As the Buddha said, the process of learning about these things is not accompanied by disappointment and sorrow. It's accompanied by joy, a sense of release that comes when you realize that you've been doing something really stupid for a long, long time, and now you've seen through it. You've understood it. You've gone beyond it. You really can cut through and free yourself from the defilements of the mind. When the path comes together in the mind, you see on the one hand that there is such a thing as the deathless, and on the other hand, that you've attained it through mastering your own intentions, understanding the process of the mind. There is more to experience than simply the conditioned and fabricated things we normally experience. That right there cuts through a lot of fetters. It's like cutting off your arm, which may not be a pretty idea, but once the arm is cut off, it's off. And even though the doctors may try to sew it back on, It's never quite the same. There is such a thing as a permanent change. And even without getting to the noble attainments, you find that having more mastery and more understanding over the processes of the mind puts you in a much better position. You understand yourself better. You cause less suffering for yourself. You understand other people better and cause them less suffering as well. So this is a project that's really worth giving your life to. And it gives meaning to your life. It gives a direction to your life. You develop a new relationship to yourself. Ultimately, you get to the point where you don't need a sense of identity. But in the meantime, you develop a skillful sense. There is a sense of self-esteem that comes with knowing that you can learn. No matter how old you are, no matter how little or how much time is left to your life, you can still learn. The issue came up a while back. People who are really driven to accomplish things, really driven to develop a sense of self around their accomplishments, are noticing that causes a lot of stress, a lot of pain and anxiety. But the answer is not to have no accomplishments, or to have no desire for accomplishments. The answer lies, first, in really getting a strong sense of what is a genuine accomplishment in life, and second, gaining a skillful sense of yourself around the process of trying to attain that accomplishment. What this comes down to is two things. The first is having a willingness to learn. If that's where your sense of identity, your self-esteem is focused, it's skillful. Gain the ability to look at something you've done and realize that there may be something wrong here, but that doesn't have to threaten your identity. It just calls forth your desire to learn more about what did you do wrong, why was it wrong, what could you do in the future not to repeat that mistake. A second aspect of this more skillful sense of self is a sense of self that understands what's an important question. What's an issue that's worth pursuing? And what are the issues you don't really have to pursue? Here again, the practice gives you a good strong direction. Any issue related to why there is suffering and what you can do to put an end to it. That's an important issue. You hear about people who are suddenly told by their doctors they have, say, 3 months or 3 weeks to live, and they suddenly develop a very strong sense of what they really want out of the remainder of their life. They clear away all the distractions and focus on what's really important. And it's good that they do that, but it's sad that they had to wait for a death sentence before they do. We have to remember we are all here with a death sentence. It's simply that we don't have the days marked out for us, how much longer it's going to be. But we do know that we have a limited amount of time, yet we tend to forget that. We act as if we didn't know. So keep that in mind. Death is down the line. Maybe even before death, illness will come and make it more and more difficult to practice. So the question is, what are the really important things you want to take care of while you still got the chance? This is the big issue. Looking at your own actions to see where they cause suffering and stress, and to figure out how you can act in a way that doesn't. And the skills you learn in the process of focusing on that important issue will serve you in good stead all the way through aging, all the way through illness, and all the way through death. The ability to keep your mind focused on what's important and to put aside unimportant things, the willingness to learn all the time, those abilities will always serve you in good stead. So this is how we give meaning to life. Finding an issue that gives direction and focuses on the really important problems in life, that has the potential to take us to some place where real changes can be made, changes that make a true difference. It's one of the reasons why Dharma practice is something you really can give your life to, because it gives meaning back to your life. The Brahmaviharas on the Path. November 13, 2008. The Buddha often used images of gradual practice, a gradual change to illustrate the path of practice. There's one passage where he says it's like a stairway. You go from one step to the next, without jumping up a whole set of stairs. There's another passage where he talks about the floor of the ocean gradually getting deeper and deeper, till it finally hits a precipice. In other passages, he talks about developing virtue, and then, once you've got your virtue, you develop mindfulness and contentment, and from mindfulness and contentment, you work on the hindrances, develop concentration, And finally develop discernment, which makes it sound like you have to perfect one step before you can get to the next. But you have to remember that the point in the practice where virtue is perfected is when all 8 factors of the Noble Path come together. One of the results of the first stage of awakening is that you've completed all the work you have to do in terms of virtue, but you still have work to do in terms of concentration and discernment. That doesn't mean, however, you didn't work on concentration and discernment to get there. You needed them both. After all, they're there in the path, which means you can't wait until your virtue is perfect before you work on meditation. All 3 parts of the training help one another along. So you don't have to wait until your virtue is perfect, or you've got loads and loads of merit, before you start meditating. You start it right now. And you'll notice as you work on the meditation that the more virtuous you are, the more you can exercise restraint in the course of the day, the more you can be generous and develop other good qualities throughout the day, the easier it will be to meditate. The fact that you're meditating, strengthening your mindfulness and concentration, makes it easier to develop those good qualities throughout the day. It's like washing your hands. Your left hand washes your right hand, and your right hand washes your left hand. That way they both get clean. So as you're sitting here, don't worry about how much you have or haven't completed the other factors of the path. Focus on the ones you're working on right now. At the same time, when you're going through the rest of the day, when you're not sitting with your eyes closed, when you're engaged with other activities, don't worry about sitting with your eyes closed. Just keep asking yourself, what's the skillful thing to do now? Try to bring some sense of ease with the breath into all your other activities. It'll make it easier to do the skillful thing and step back from unskillful mind states that pop up, where you get upset, where you get flustered, angry, whatever. You'll develop more resistance to those mind states. It's in this way that all the elements of the practice help one another along, and the whole day can be devoted to the practice of developing the mind. There's a passage where the Buddha says that a stingy person cannot attain the noble attainments, can't even attain jhana. But he also says that the quality of your generosity will grow as your meditation advances. In other words, generosity helps your meditation. Your meditation makes it easier to be generous in ways that grow more and more large-hearted. This is particularly true when you're working on developing the Brahmaviharas. Ajahn Lee describes that the Brahmaviharas is food for your precepts. And that's how the Buddha presents them as well. There's a passage where he talks about reflecting on the fact that you've made mistakes in the past. You've broken the precepts, harmed other people. The proper attitude to have toward that, he says, is to realize that you can't go back and undo the mistake, and sitting there stewing about it is not going to help, either. So you resolve that you're not going to repeat the mistake. You're going to exercise restraint in the future. Then, to strengthen that resolve, you develop the Brahmaviharas: unlimited goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. This helps to ensure that you're going to stick with that resolve to exercise restraint, because if you really feel goodwill for other people, you're not going to harm them. If you feel goodwill for them, then when you see them suffering, you want to help. That's compassion. If you see that they're already happy, you want them to continue being happy. That's empathetic joy. If you realize that there's nothing you can do to help them or the situation that you yourself are encountering, then the kindest thing is to develop equanimity toward the things you can't change, which frees you to focus on the things you can. So goodwill underlies all 4 of the Brahmaviharas. It's the essential one. It helps you maintain your precepts. It helps develop concentration. The Buddha also talks about the levels of jhana you can attain by developing goodwill in the other Brahmaviharas. And if you do it right, it's also an exercise in discernment. You can't just sit there beaming out nice thoughts and think that that's going to take care of the problem. If, when you get up for meditation, you see that somebody has done something outrageous, then if you haven't really thought the matter through, your immediate reaction will be to get upset again. Here it's important to understand that goodwill doesn't mean that you're going to like people. You simply don't want them to meet with harm. You want them to meet with true happiness. You've got to learn how to develop that attitude in a proper way. That means both understanding the principle of karma and also understanding how you fabricate feelings in the mind so that they really are genuine. This is where the Brahmavihara practice leads to discernment. Part of the discernment also lies in the exercise of equanimity, realizing when it's appropriate to develop equanimity as an act of kindness to yourself and to others, as opposed to when you focus more directly on the other Brahmaviharas. But you also have to understand what it means to wish for people to be happy. You want them to do things that lead to happiness. It's not like you're pretending you can take a magic wand and wave it over their heads and they'll immediately be happy. That's not how it works. The principle of karma says that if you're going to be happy, you have to do things that are skillful. So if you want to imagine people being happy, you have to imagine them doing skillful things, being generous, being happy and being generous, being happy and exercising restraint. And if it's not too much of a stretch, think of them being happy meditating. In the Metta Sutta in the Sutta Nipata, where the Buddha talks about how to express a thought of goodwill, he doesn't simply say, "May all beings be happy." That's part of what he has to say, but not all. He goes through all the various categories of beings: long, middling and short, seen, unseen, big and small. But he also says, "May all beings not despise anyone." In other words, may they not create the causes for unskillful actions. So you have to think about cause and effect, and realize that if the people you don't like could actually understand the causes for happiness, the world would be a much better place. This is why you can't have your likes get in the way of universal goodwill. Goodwill is one thing. Liking and disliking other people, that's something else. We're not pretending that everybody is okay, or that everybody is nice. We simply realize the world would be a much better place if everybody understood the causes of happiness and would act on them. That's something you can wish without feeling hypocritical. It's not make-believe. So that's one area in which you start developing right view in the process of developing goodwill. Then you take it further by learning how to develop a feeling of goodwill that you really feel down into your bones. How are you going to do that? You can't simply repeat goodwill phrases. There's more to a genuine feeling than that. As the Buddha said, you fabricate your emotions through 3 kinds of fabrication: physical, verbal, and mental. The breath counts as physical fabrication. Directed thought and evaluation count as verbal fabrication. And feelings and perceptions count as mental fabrication. The breath is what actually takes an emotion and makes it real in the body. So a good way to start with the Brahmaviharas is to learn how to breathe in a way that feels really good. You have to develop some sense of well-being within yourself before you can wish it for other people. Ajahn Lee's image is of a water tank. If there's no water in the tank, then when you open the faucet, all that comes out is air. In other words, you have to have the water of well-being inside before you can offer real water to other people. So you work on breathing in a way that feels really good, and use your directed thought and evaluation, the verbal fabrication, to help with that. But that can help with other issues as well. You can start thinking about how, if there are people out there who you really have trouble feeling goodwill for, it's in your best interest to develop goodwill for them. One of the images the Buddha gives is of a person walking across a desert, hot and trembling with thirst, coming across a little tiny puddle of water in a cow's footprint. He realizes that if he's going to drink the water, he'll have to get down on his hands and feet and slurp it up. If he tries to scoop it up with his hand, it's going to get muddy. So he very carefully puts his mouth down on the ground and slurps up that little bit of water. This image describes you when you're angry. Notice your position. You're hot and trembling with thirst. You can't afford to focus on the bad points of other people, because that's going to get you even hotter and thirstier. Your goodness is going to burn away. You look at the human race and don't see that there's anything good out there. There's no reason to treat people kindly because they're all selfish or whatever. If that's your thinking, then you're going to make it harder and harder to develop your own goodness. So your goodness requires that you think about the goodness of other people, no matter how little it may be. It's not that you're pretending that they have a lot of goodness, but you have to focus on it, realizing that there is some goodness in these people. You don't have to wait for everybody to have Buddha nature before they're good enough for you to treat well. Just a little bit of goodness is enough to nourish your own goodness. Because it's not a question of their deserving your goodwill. You need to develop goodwill for your own well-being. So when you think in these ways, holding these perceptions in mind, you can develop a more and more genuine feeling of goodwill, a feeling that's not threatened by the fact that other people are going to continue to act in sometimes really outrageous and horrible ways. Because when you see them acting in horrible ways, you've got to have compassion for them. They are creating causes for suffering. As you develop these thoughts of goodwill, you're giving yourself a stronger foundation for your own virtue, creating a stronger foundation for concentration, and gaining some practice in understanding this process of fabrication, which is what discernment is all about. To see how states of mind are fabricated, how emotions are fabricated both in body and mind, and to get more and more sensitive to how this process takes place. So it's not the case that you work on virtue and then, when it's all taken care of, you move on to concentration. Or that when that's all taken care of, you move on to discernment. You have to work on developing the mind in such a way that all three parts of the training work together, help one another along. So even though the process is gradual, it's gradual in a sense that all three develop together. Keep this point in mind. As you sit down to meditate, working on developing your concentration, it's not only concentration that's going to get developed. If you learn how to carry the concentration into your daily life, you're going to gain help with your virtue, looking after the precepts and helping with your discernment. So learn not to compartmentalize the practice. Remember it's all of a piece, and that all the different facets of the practice help one another along. Goodwill first and last. November 20, 2008. It's traditional to begin and end each session of meditation with thoughts of goodwill for all beings without exception. The purpose in each case is different. In the beginning, you start the meditation with thoughts of goodwill as a way of putting the mind in the right frame, in the right context to meditate. You want to pull yourself out of your own little personal narrative, the events of the day, and take a larger view before you settle down and look at the present moment. If you don't, it's very likely that you'll take your narrative into the present moment with you. If it's an unpleasant narrative, it makes the present moment unpleasant as well. If it's been a bad day and you sit down and try to get the mind into the present moment to stay with the breath, and you find it doesn't stay with the breath. If you've been down on yourself in the course of the day, you get down on yourself even more. You're a miserable meditator. You can't do it. See? You keep wandering off the breath. More proof that you're miserable. So a good way to break that connection is to start thinking a few thoughts of infinity, of all beings everywhere without exception. Like that character in Through the Looking Glass, who says he likes to think of 2 or 3 impossible things every morning before breakfast. Think about infinity a couple of times a day. It changes your perspective. And you're actually following the pattern of the Buddha on the night of his awakening. The 3 knowledges that he gained, part of full awakening, follow this pattern as well. The first knowledge was recollection of his past lives, all his narratives going back many eons. And notice, he didn't go from that knowledge straight to the present moment. The second knowledge had to do with all living beings. He'd seen in his first knowledge that he had gone through many lifetimes, in many different roles, many different levels of being. But that knowledge left some questions unanswered. Was he the only one who had those many levels of being? And why were there so many? Why were they so varied? So in the second watch of the night, he inclined his mind to the knowledge of the passing away and re-arising of all beings everywhere. And he saw that everybody goes through this process of death and rebirth. Everybody changes roles, changes levels. If you look simply at the individual narrative, these changes seem to follow a very erratic course, up and down. The Buddha himself said that it was like throwing a stick up in the air. Sometimes it lands on this end, sometimes it lands on that end, sometimes it lands flat in the middle. But it Doesn't seem to have much rhyme or reason. But as he saw things in the larger context, he began to see there was a pattern. People took rebirth in line with their karma, in line with their actions. And their actions were based on their views. People who had acted on wrong views, had no respect for the noble ones, tended to go to bad destinations. People who had acted on right views, who had respect for the noble ones, went to good destinations. So there was a pattern. The pattern was determined by view and intention. And it was only after seeing the larger pattern that he was ready to focus on the present moment, within the proper terms events in the mind viewed as causes and effects, and with the proper question. How do view and intention operate in the present moment? Is there some way that this knowledge can be used to put an end to suffering? In the third watch of the night, that's what he found. Looking at intentions as skillful and unskillful, looking at views as right and wrong, and applying those perspectives to the question of suffering, he discovered the Four Noble Truths. He applied them, followed the tasks appropriate to them, and gained awakening. So notice the pattern. It starts with his own narratives, moves to the larger picture, and then focuses in on the present moment. This is what we have to do as we settle down to meditate. You remind yourself that you're here for the sake of goodwill, for the sake of true happiness. And you realize you're not the only one out there who has to train his or her mind. Everybody has to train the mind. It's not an easy process for anybody. Some people may find it easier than others, but that's because they did the work in the past. So taking this larger view reminds you of your intention for being here, and it also reminds you that when things aren't going well in the meditation, you're not the only one for whom they are not going well. I've been counseling some people in a Dharma study program. And their experience with retreats up to this point had been that you go in, you don't talk to anybody, and you go home. So as you're sitting there in the retreat hall meditating, everybody else looks so calm and still, and yet you're fighting with your hindrances, with your defilements. You seem to be the only person who is suffering that way. But when these people come on a study retreat, they get a chance to talk with one another, and they discover that everybody goes through the same thing. Everybody has the same problems. And instead of being discouraging, it's actually encouraging. You realize that even though things may take a lot longer than you had hoped, the fact that they take long doesn't mean it's hopeless. It's the common pattern throughout the world. When you see the larger pattern and understand it, you're in a much better position to focus on the present moment with the right attitude, with the right sense of balance. So spreading thoughts of unlimited goodwill help in this direction is a way of preparing you to settle down with the breath. Then actually being with the breath is a very good way of showing goodwill for yourself right now. There's enough suffering in life. You don't have to compound it by breathing in a way that's harsh, uncomfortable, or unhealthy. So you look at the breath and see how it's affecting the body in different parts. Where the breath energy seems comfortable, where it seems strained, what you can do to make it comfortable throughout, all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out, and all the way through all the different parts of the body. You start seeing which part of the breath cycle you push too much. Are you squeezing out breath energy too much as you breathe out? Are you making the breath too long as you breathe in? Notice how you relate to the different parts of the cycle. Notice also how you relate to the different parts of the body as you breathe in, the different levels of breath energy in the body, because the breath enters the body at different rates. There's the breath coming in and out of the lungs, which takes a while to fill the lungs. But there's also the energy that flows in the nerves, which goes a lot faster. In fact, as soon as you've started to breathe in, before you even notice it, the breath has already gone through all your nerves, unless there's a blockage someplace. Some people say as they breathe in and try to get the breath to go to the different parts of the body, they can't get it all the way down the body, say all the way down the legs by the time the lungs are full. That's because they're trying to force a harsh breath or a heavy breath down the legs, which is not actually good for the legs. Think of the breath in the nerves and the blood vessels as a lot subtler, a lot lighter, a lot faster. See how that works. You have to do a lot of experimenting because each of us relates to the breath in different ways, relates to the energy in the body in different ways. And so each of us has different habits we have to learn how to correct. This is one of the reasons in the forest tradition the Ajahns are sometimes seemingly so harsh with their students, as the students are not observant about the little things going on in daily life. And the reason for this is that the Ajahns want to make the point that you have to be very, very observant. If you can't observe the little things in daily life, you won't be able to observe the even littler things in the course of your meditation. So that's what we're doing here in the present moment. Exploring how the breath in the body feels right here in this world of the body right here, without reference to the world outside. Just this world of energy. The more you can get into it, the more you can get yourself immersed in it, the more you begin to notice the subtleties of the energy, the better. The body feels better. The mind gets more and more concentrated, feels less and less frazzled. Which puts you in a good position at the end of the meditation to spread thoughts of goodwill again. This serves two purposes. 1. It reminds you, when you leave the meditation, how you want to relate to other people. You want to relate in a way that's conducive both to your happiness and to theirs. 2. The force of a concentrated mind can actually make that wish for goodwill more effective. I know many stories of people who have sensed when somebody's been meditating and spreading thoughts of goodwill to them specifically, and they realize it, they sense it. The power of a concentrated mind gives a lot more energy to the thoughts that you focus on as you are leaving meditation. So you want them to be thoughts of goodwill. They're good for you. They're good for the world. So when you spread thoughts of goodwill at the beginning of the meditation, it's primarily for your own sake. When you spread them at the end of the meditation, it's primarily for the sake of others. But notice that primarily. It's not exclusively just for you or just for them. When you show goodwill to others, you're helping yourself. And when you help yourself in the right way, you're helping others as well. Try to make this a regular part of your meditation. At the beginning, thoughts of goodwill for everyone, everywhere, and as you leave the meditation, again, thoughts of goodwill for everyone, everywhere. This creates the right framework, the right context for the meditation. It keeps you on track. You find that good breathing helps with goodwill, and goodwill helps with good breathing. This is a common pattern throughout the Buddha's teachings. It is possible to find a happiness that's good for you, and good for others, the kind of happiness where everybody benefits. Internally, this means both body and mind. Externally, it means both you and everybody around you. That's the kind of happiness we're working toward. A stranger to your thoughts. November 21, 2008. As we're meditating, we're working toward two things. One is stillness and the other one is discernment. They go together. They are not two radically different processes. Because after all, to get the mind to settle down and be still, you have to discern what's going on in the mind. And to discern really clearly, you have to get the mind to be still. But this is not a catch-22. These two sides develop gradually. It's not an all-or-nothing kind of affair. As the mind gets gradually more still, you gradually see more. As you see more, it enables the mind to get even more still. You simply find yourself leaning to one direction or the other as you practice. It's like walking. You lean to the left, you lean to right. You use your left foot, use your right. And as for whether you start out with your left foot or start out with your right, that's not something you can choose. When you sit down, you may find that the mind is ready to get still, so you just follow it, allow it to be still. Other times, it's not. So each time you sit down to meditate, take stock of the mind. How is it doing? Is it feeling inclined to settle down? Or is it not? And if it's not, what is it getting worked up about? What thoughts are preventing it from settling down? You have to work with those first. And how do you work with those thoughts? Try to make yourself a stranger to them. In other words, when you see the mind incline in a certain direction, ask yourself, why on earth would you want to think about that? Allow yourself to be surprised. Look at things with new eyes, like a scientist who takes a common assumption and questions it, like Isaac Newton. Back in his days, it was believed that things fell to earth because it was simply their nature to go down. That explanation of "it's their nature to do that" covers up a lot of ignorance. So he asked, "Why do they go down?" And he came up with an unusual conclusion, as with the apple. Apparently he didn't really watch an apple fall. But suppose an apple falls from a tree. Not only is the earth pulling the apple down, but the apple is also pulling the earth up a little bit. But because the earth is so much bigger, it's the apple that falls. But it wasn't the nature of matter to go down necessarily as much as it's the nature of matter to attract. Of course, we still don't understand that attraction. Einstein came along and said, well, actually it's a warp in space-time. He took a number of other basic assumptions and questioned them too. It's when you question your assumptions that you see new things, because for the most part we don't even see our assumptions. A thought comes up about something that would be good to eat or good to see, and we immediately think, well, it must be good to eat, it must be good to see, it must be good to think about. So ask yourself, why on earth? Why regard that as good to eat or good to see? Why should I be thinking about that now? Pose those questions in the mind and see what comes up. Sometimes the simple act of putting that little question mark next to your thought is enough to kill it. It's the kind of thought that survives only because it's subterranean. As soon as it sees the light of day, it dies. Like certain worms that live underground, as soon as they are exposed to the outside air they die. Other thoughts don't die quite so quickly, so you have to keep probing. What's the underlying assumption here? And as long as you're dealing with a thought that has a pull on the mind, but without allowing yourself to get pulled along with it, there is a chance you will see some interesting things. And when it finally strikes you that the thought is strange, and it doesn't really have that pull anymore, then the mind is ready to settle down. Here again you can use your discernment in the other direction to remind yourself of why you want to settle down, what's to be gained from getting the mind still. And there's a lot to be gained. You see things more clearly, you are less a slave to your thoughts. The mind gets to rest. We use the mind all day long. Even when we're asleep we dream about all kinds of things. The mind needs time just to be by itself. And then you will find after a while it gets tired of being still. It wants some more action. You can either question that, or else you can make use of the mind's willingness to think by actively questioning whatever else is coming up. It depends on the situation. So it goes back and forth like this. Stillness, questioning, stillness, questioning. Sometimes the mere fact of stillness allows you to see things you didn't see before. Sometimes it doesn't. You can't always trust whatever comes up in the still mind. One of Ajahn Lee's techniques for testing insights is to ask, to what extent is the opposite true? For example, you start seeing how inconstant things are. He says to look for the aspect that's constant. Where it's stressful, look for the aspect that's pleasurable. And vice versa. Things that are not self. All too often we believe that if our insights fall in line with what the book says, then they must be true insights. But that's not always for certain. Turn around and question your insights. Flip them over and see to what extent the opposite is true. That way you add some nuance to your insights. And it protects you from running away. Because this can often happen. You get an insight and it starts adding on to that insight and connecting with this insight, and all of a sudden you find yourself way off in the Andromeda galaxy, far, far away from what's actually going on. The whole point of insight is you want to be able to watch the process of thoughts arising in the mind, to see where there's the intentional element to go with the thought. That's where the defilement is hiding out. Why do you want to go with a particular thought? What's its appeal? This is why the Buddha said that seeing things arising and passing away is only part of insight. The other part is to see their allure. Why do you like the thought? What pulls you in? Then look at the drawbacks. What happens when you get pulled in by that thought? And finally, what understanding allows you to escape from it? If it's something that's not arising and passing away right now, you can just put it aside. Look for the things that are arising and nibbling away at your concentration, or actually blocking your concentration. Because those are the important things to analyze. You can read about how everything in the world is inconstant. The trees are inconstant. The mountains are inconstant. But if you're not attached to the trees or the mountains, then their inconstancy doesn't really mean anything. It's not the issue. It's where you're trying to find your pleasure, where you're attached. That's what you want to analyze in these terms. Because again, those ways of analysis make you a stranger to your thoughts, which is precisely what you want. To see them in new eyes. Suppose someone else were looking in your head and watching your thoughts right now, and would ask you, why are you thinking that? Why this? Try to be that stranger so that you don't simply take your thoughts for granted. The same with your assumptions, which contain within them all your defilements. Don't take them for granted. See them as strange. See them as curious. Why would you believe that? Why would you want that? Why would you like that? And when you gain some insight, question that as well until the mind has had enough of this questioning, and it's ready to settle down. This way you find your meditation leaning a little bit to the left, leaning a little bit to the right. And that way you walk along. And you find that the breath is an ideal place to do this walking. Because you can use the breath as an object to settle down and be still with, and you can also use it as a grounding for your analysis. When a thought comes up, notice how it affects the breath. Or when you breathe in a certain way, notice what that way of breathing does to the mind. If you can locate the part of the body that's tensed up around a thought, breathe through it and see what that does. This way you can walk in your breath. Leaning to the left means you lean towards investigating and questioning. You can question the breath or use the breath as a handle for the questioning. If you feel a need to lean toward the right, to get the mind to settle down and be still, okay, you use the breath as a means for settling, for fully inhabiting the present moment. So remember that the meditation has these two sides. It needs both in order to be complete. The Buddha never made any radical distinction between the two sides. He says to get into jhana or strong absorption, you need both tranquility and insight. And to develop tranquility and insight, you need jhana. They're all part of the same whole, it's simply that you be leaning in one direction or the other at any one point in time. But he never has you hop all the time on one foot. Whichever foot you start out with and however long you spend on either side, that's up to you. Learn how to read the mind and its needs, and you'll find that the meditation will take you where you want to go. As today's session draws to a close, we extend an invitation for ongoing engagement. Just as Buddha urged sharing his teachings, we invite your active participation. Help disseminate these invaluable insights universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your involvement ensures these teachings resonate widely, fostering positive change and understanding. We eagerly anticipate your continued presence in future episodes, uniting to illuminate minds and sow seeds of compassion globally.